Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I've heard a lot about Pork Fest here just very recently. I wasn't even aware that it existed until I think probably about a month ago. I've known about the Free State Project and what's been doing up here for a long time, and it's something I'm very interested in. Even back when I was a defense contractor in Iraq after the military, that's when I started researching, liberty movements, and I found what was happening here, and it was incredible. So just a little background to give some perspective. I was in the military. I was a flight medic in the Army. Served multiple combat tours, got out, became a defense contractor. Worked as a contractor to several of the agencies over the years, spent about 8 years doing that. Became a pilot during that time. There came a point, I saw what was happening overseas, what was happening, the contract companies I was working for, what was happening in the federal government. And I was in my early 20s, and it was something that really concerned me because it's not right. It's not following the Constitution of the United States. We're getting involved in all these foreign wars and all these things we shouldn't be involved in. We should be taking care of problems at home. So fast forwarding to 2020 and COVID, it was something that I've been following for a long time. We know that they've been actively disrupting our Constitution and our freedom. And so when I saw the rollout of COVID and saw what was happening with the government, the lockdowns, and all of that, obviously we were thinking vaccine mandates, looking at that as they were developing the vaccine. And it was very concerning, the data that was coming out. They kept it very quiet. But for those of us that were digging and were digging deeply, we saw that there were a lot of side effects that started happening after they rolled out the vaccines. So at this point, I was working for a major U.S. airline. And as many of you know, they were probably some of the most totalitarian companies on the planet. And in August of 2021, they said basically you're going to get the jab or lose your job. That was pretty much the general consensus. And it started with United Airlines. There was no federal mandate at the time, but we were very concerned that a federal mandate was coming. And so I was sitting in a hotel room in Chicago back in August and thinking about this, and I called a friend of mine. He'd made a post on Facebook about freedom. I knew we had to do something. I didn't know what to do. We had a discussion that evening, and I decided to reach out to the Stu Peters show and say, look, I don't agree with what's happening here. United had just come out with a mandate. There was no federal mandate yet, but we were anticipating it. So that was really the formation of U.S. Freedom Flyers. On August 11th, I went on the Stu Peters show and said, look, I don't agree with this, and I think we need to do something about it. So that's when airline pilots and other employees, we started coming together. We started forming groups on Telegram, preparing for this mandate that we believed was coming, and sure enough, it did come about a month and a half later. And I can tell you that it was absolute chaos. There was a lot of fear within airline employees. We didn't know what was going to happen, and we were prepared to lose our jobs over it. Because we certainly weren't going to get it. We saw what was happening with the adverse reactions. Even at that time, I knew of heart attacks and strokes and blood clots just among friends of mine that had gotten it. So U.S. Freedom Flyers started out as a liberty organization standing up for individual rights and freedoms, specifically against the vaccine mandates. And the most effective thing that we ever did was we pushed back and we said no. Not lawsuits, nothing else. When you take a large group of people and companies that can't afford to lose 5 to 10% of their employees, and you stand up against them, they don't really have a choice but to cave to you. But they did definitely try to scare us. There were people that were called in for disciplinary hearings, things like that. People were threatened and coerced. Many people did fold, which was incredibly sad. And many of those people, I can tell you now, all of them regret it. The stories that I hear today, the things that are happening, and I'll get into that a bit more. And I don't want to just talk about the problems today. I want to talk about the solutions and how we fight this. But in order for us to understand the solutions, we have to understand what it is, that we're up against. So long story short, our first cutoff date was November 24th, the day before Thanksgiving. They said, get the jab or you're going to lose your job. And that really kicked us into high gear. And you probably saw the meltdowns that happened at Southwest and American Airlines. They had those weekends, about 3 or 4 days. There were, so many flights canceled. They lost hundreds of millions of dollars. And they would have you believe that had to do with weather. The interesting thing is there was no weather. It was the winds of tyranny that were blowing, and people had enough. Well, that sent a message, and the CEOs actually ran off to D.C., went and met with the Biden administration, and magically the cutoff date got pushed back to January 4th, which was perfect for us because we weren't as organized as we needed to be, and it gave us more time to organize. But U.S. Freedom Flyers did file a lawsuit against the Biden administration on, I believe it was November 22nd, challenging the federal contractor clause of that vaccine mandate, which we know is highly illegal. And so that actually is on a stay in court because there was a similar case brought by, I believe it was the Attorney General from the state of Florida. It was very similar, so we put that case on hold and we're pursuing other litigation. We're waiting to see the outcome of that in the 11th Circuit. But as it stands, we got to January 4th, and the airlines realized that if they kept up these totalitarian mandates and didn't accept religious and medical exemptions, they weren't going to have airlines. You look at American Airlines now and Delta and United, all these big ones. You look at the chaos that's ensuing with their flight structures that's currently happening. You're seeing hundreds of flights being canceled. They're losing tons of money, and they're blaming it on pilot shortages, which is actually true. But let's first talk about why that's actually happening. So what we're seeing now, the most important thing that I'm concerned about is the human toll. Obviously it's freedom and all of that, but what we're seeing now is all these people that were coerced into getting the vaccines back in October and November, we're starting to see adverse reactions. And I can tell you, this is something that the airlines don't want to talk about. The FAA doesn't want to talk about it. It was back in, I think it was December, the FDA came out and they said, look, these vaccines are approved. 2 days later, the FAA said, we're going to recommend these vaccines for all pilots. We think you should go out and get them. 0 long-term safety studies. This has never happened at the FAA. A pilot can't even take benign medications like Benadryl. I can't take Benadryl tonight and go fly tomorrow. It's prohibited. So they've done tons of studies on this that said it affects pilot performance. But when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccines, because of the political pressure that was coming down from the Department of Transportation, and what we know was now Pete Buttigieg was actually pressuring the FAA, and this is coming out. This is going to be coming out in internal affidavits from the FAA. There's actually a large group of aviation of agents and inspectors that are now coming forward, and they're going to be blowing the whistle on what actually happened internally at the agency. And that's what we need. We need people from all walks of life, all aspects fighting this. This isn't something that I can do, not something that pilots can do. It's something it requires all of us standing up to a tyrannical government, because that's what it's really about here. So you may have heard of some of the vaccine reactions that we've seen in pilots. People like pilot Cody Flint. He was an agricultural pilot down in Mississippi. He went and got the vaccine because he believed it was the right thing to do. And when he saw that the FAA was encouraging pilots to get it, he believed that the long-term safety studies had been done. He didn't really look into it. He was lied to. He was completely let down by the very agency, or by the very group of people who were supposed to be protecting him. And they have, very rigorously done that in the past. I mean, their charter is to create the safest aerospace system in the world. And they really dropped the ball on this one due to political pressure. And so Cody took off to fly the first load of fertilizer for the season down in the Mississippi Delta. And a couple passes across the field, he developed tunnel vision, and he went to pull up over power lines at the end of the field, never really exceeded 400 feet. So you can't blame pressure for what happened to him. Both of his inner ears ruptured. And at that point, he developed really severe tunnel vision. He said he lost all equilibrium. He didn't know which way was up or down. He said he remembered seeing like a 4-lane highway, and he was going to try to land the plane on the highway. But then he realized there were cars, and he would cause fatalities. And so he didn't want to do that. So he paralleled the highway for a bit, and then he turned back towards the airport about 7 miles away. He said he remembers seeing it in the distance, and that's the last thing that he remembers. He goes cold. And the next thing that he remembers is being pulled out of the aircraft by the ground crew back in his normal parking spot at the airport where he took off from, and he has no idea how he got back there. And I believe that he was protected to come out. He was one of the first people that came out, and it was right at a time when I was being discredited by the airlines and by the unions. They were saying what Josh is out there saying is a bunch of nonsense. This actually isn't happening. And I knew it was happening because I was having conversations with the people who were affected. And then Cody Flint stepped up, and he said, actually, what he's saying is true. This happened to me. And he's been diagnosed. He had the rupture of both 2 inner ear fistulas. And he now has 4 specialists, 2 in Canada and 2 in the U.S., that have said definitively it came from the vaccine, because he had developed 300% intracranial pressure. And the only way that can happen is through massive head trauma or from a vaccine injury. And so now multiple larger medical studies have been done, and we've conclusively proven this. About the same time that Cody Flint came out, just about a week later, a major airline captain by the name of Greg Pearson. Greg did the same thing. He came out and defended me, and he did so publicly in the media. And so then we started to build momentum. We started to build credibility, because people were starting to see that what we were saying wasn't nonsense. This is a very real thing, and it's affecting the safety of the American passenger. And these companies, they have committed criminal and civil atrocities against everyone, and we're going to hold them accountable. That's what U.S. Freedom Flyers is about. So in addition to that, you probably saw on April 9th, it made some fairly large media, did not make the national news media. Captain Bob Snow was another victim. He was vaccinated, I believe, on November 9th, and he did it under coercion. He never wanted to get it. He's the only person in his family who's vaccinated. And he was flying American Airlines 1067 from Denver to Dallas-Fort Worth. 6 minutes after touchdown, they block in at the gate, set the parking brake. The first officer gets up to go to the lavatory, which is normal. He goes to stand up to collect his bags, and he collapses goes into cardiac arrest in the flight deck. That's the last thing that he remembers. Very fortunately for him, that cardiac arrest happened when it did, at the gate, with a nurse and a Navy corpsman on board who were able to pull him out. They did CPR on him in the jet bridge until they could hook up the AED. They had to shock him 3 times to bring him back, intubate him, take him to the ICU. He doesn't remember anything for 24 hours. And when he woke up, he was talking to a friend who recommended that he reach out to me, and he did so. And what's really interesting about this is he was 10 minutes away from American Airlines headquarters and the APA headquarters, which is the union that represents American Airlines pilots. But none of them showed up to help him or to even visit him. No flowers. They did fly his family up from South Texas, but there was zero support from the company or the union. And the reason there's no support is because they knew exactly what happened. And he was blaming it on the vaccine. And I told him, I said, Bob, we really need you to make a video from the ICU. I said, you know what happens. And there was actually history there. He had been having some issues, but the doctors were telling him, oh, no, it's gastrointestinal issues, it's whatever. And he said he knew all along it was vaccine. And so what has happened now is we're actually proving that through a series of cardiac MRIs, D-dimer tests, troponin levels, all these things. And the airlines are on the run because this is a guy they can't shut up. And it endangered the passengers of that flight. And I'm actually in contact with passengers from that flight, and they're very upset. It's a massive breach of consumer trust is what that is. And I can tell you the 3 stories that I just told you, these are one of many. We've had deaths. We've had cardiac arrest in flight that you've never heard about. There have been strokes. There have been blood clots. There's people, our long-term disability rates are spiking. Airlines can't staff. And they would blame it on retirements at the airlines, which is a problem, to be fair. It's something that's been projected for a long time. Over about the next 9 years, we're losing around 50% of major airline pilots due to the mandatory retirement age of 65, which is an FAA rule. But then in addition to that, they've kind of created the perfect storm because during COVID, they offered early retirement programs for senior personnel who they were trying to stop the financial bleeding that was going on while they had hundreds of airplanes parked everywhere. With little foresight as to how quickly travel was going to come back. And now we're seeing the vaccine injuries, and it's culminated into this massive problem and all these cancellations that you're seeing. And airlines are booking flights that they can't fly. They are canceling the flights and blaming them on weather so that they don't have to pay for a hotel or you're rebooking, things like that. Because if they coded it crew, they would be responsible to refund you, rebook you, get you a hotel, that type of thing. So now all this has come together into the perfect storm, and now the consumer is being defrauded. And that's something that is going to be addressed here shortly. There's a group of people working on that. And one of the things we've done to address this now at U.S. Freedom Flyers is, one, we've continued to organize behind the scenes. We're networking with groups just like you across the nation, because this is something, to find a solution, we need to bring all these groups together. We need to all pull in the same direction. And we need to hold the government accountable first and foremost, and then the companies who've been working as the enforcement arm of the U.S. government. And we can definitively prove that. We can show the chain of coercion. We can show that the government and the vaccine manufacturers actually knew that the product they were going to bring out was going to cause harm. Because now the studies have come out, Pfizer, Moderna, J&J. J&J has been pulled off the market in many countries around the world because of the blood clotting issues that were going on and causing brain bleeds and pulmonary embolisms. And we had another captain, Will Wolf at American Airlines. He got vaccinated, very much against his will. I've got to know his wife, Claudia, very well. And, Claudia, she cries every time she talks about this. It's really emotional. He never wanted to get it. He was forced. He said, look, I have to feed my family. I don't know how else to do it. So he goes out and he gets the J&J shot, and days later he dies from a severe brain hemorrhage. And the start of his symptoms was a rapid onset of a tonic-clonic seizure, which is like large stiffening of large muscle groups, right? And he's an Airbus pilot, so we have a side stick on the Airbus, and if he's flying that, it's fairly sensitive, right? If he had a tonic-clonic seizure when he's at 200 or 300 feet landing an Airbus, there's a probability that he could have pushed forward on that stick, and you could have been too low to the ground to actually initiate. You could have initiated, the first officer could have initiated a recovery. But these are large, heavy airplanes. It may or may not happen depending on your altitude. So what we've really been talking about a lot is these vaccine injuries happening during a critical phase of flight. That's when it could potentially, ultimately be fatal. And I personally believe that it's only a matter of time. And we have people like Lieutenant Colonel Teresa Long, which I really want to give. I want to point all of you to her today. She was a brave whistleblower. She's a senior Army flight surgeon, and she blew the whistle last year and actually came out as a Senate whistleblower along with Lieutenant Colonel Pete Chambers, also a very senior Army flight surgeon who's vaccine injured himself. And they came out with something known as the DMED data. So there's a database in the Department of Defense called DMED. Every time that a soldier or anybody within the Department of Defense goes in for a medical workup, an ICD code is entered into the system, and it cannot be manipulated by the doctors. It's considered to be one of the most comprehensive databases in the world, and many medical studies are based off of this database. Well, what she noticed that she was seeing was things like 300% increase in myocarditis and pericarditis, 300% increase in heart attacks, brain bleeds, rapid onset cancers, which we're seeing a lot of now, and especially in young men, testicular cancer, liver cancers, and they'll be diagnosed and they'll be dead within weeks. And yet, they had no prior history to this, and she blew the whistle on this, and this is something that's being actively covered up by the U.S. government, by the military, and obviously, the airlines don't want to hear it, the FAA doesn't want to hear it, DOT, this is a massive problem for them, and I believe the only reason she's not dead is because she is so vocal, because she has the damning evidence. And so working in conjunction with all of those folks, we're bringing this out in a series of lawsuits against the federal government, against the airlines themselves. And we believe that what we can do is we know that we can prove the collusion between the federal government and the pharmaceutical companies because they knew the data, they did the studies, and if we bring in experts into a court of law, they're going to bring in their own experts who are going to try to discredit what we're saying. So rather than do that, we're going to use their own information, their own medical studies. They knew exactly what was going on. And it doesn't matter whether we win or we lose in court. It's the fact that the information comes out and you can prove the collusion and you can prove that these organizations knew before it happened. And that means the FAA should have known, and that means the airlines should have known. And I think that before this is all said and done, you're going to see multi-billion-dollar settlements, across the industries and probably from the government. And perhaps even, who knows, maybe companies go out of business because I think this is only the beginning of the problem that we're seeing. These vaccine injuries aren't going to get better once you have this mRNA technology in your body. It's there to stay. There's things you can do to mitigate the damage that's going on. And we're working with, our focus has kind of shifted. Like I said in the beginning, it was, individual liberty and freedom and keeping our jobs. That was the focus. What we've shifted to now at U.S. Freedom Flyers is the accountability phase of this, because if we allow this to go unchecked and we don't do something about it, it's going to happen again. As a matter of fact, just as early as last week, I was on a Newsmax show, and while I was waiting to come on live, there was a doctor or scientist on ahead of me talking to the host, and he's already talking about monkeypox. That's the next thing that's coming. He said, oh yeah, there's two strains, one in Central Africa and one in West Africa. The one in West Africa, it has a lower mortality rate, but this one in Central Africa, it's really deadly. We're really concerned about it. What they're doing, this is programming. They're prepping you for the next thing that's coming. And then Biden gets on national television here a couple of days ago, and he says there will be another pandemic. So this is planned. This isn't something that happens by accident. I'm pretty sure that everyone here understands that. And that's why we have to stand up and fight right now. It is so critical. Everybody at U.S. Freedom Flyers, we came together. We had no idea how to run an organization. I had never done it before. Nobody that I was working with had ever done it before. And we did it all wrong. I can tell you, we did it all backwards, but we got through it, and we're getting through it, and we're building this out, and it's getting bigger, and now other groups like ours have popped up all around the world. We have the UK Freedom Flyers, the Aussie Freedom Flyers, and a multitude of other organizations, airline organizations specifically, and we've come together and we formed the Global Aviation Advocacy Coalition. And so now we have a network of international attorneys, our U.S. attorneys, obviously, medical professionals, including the Global COVID Summit doctors, who have all come together, and we've all partnered now, and we're fighting this on a global level and bringing litigation across the nation. And the Dutch pilots just had a big win a couple of weeks ago. The company can no longer ask the vaccine status of new hires, which is a really big deal. And so, thank you. That's That's the pressure of normal people standing up and fighting back. That's what it is. It doesn't take anybody with any special qualifications. It takes you as an individual standing up and just saying the word, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to participate. And I was just talking to a gentleman here who's in the crowd today. He's in the military. And, he stood up and said no. It started out with a larger group, and it whittled them down to 7. And now they're being kicked out of the military, given, dishonorable discharges, being completely mistreated. And this is unconscionable that this is happening to the people of our nation who are actually defending our nation. And it's going to take all of us, making our voices heard to the government. We are the government, right? What this has morphed into is not representative of the founding documents of this country, and that's why we're here today. And so I just want to give you some hope in that action is definitely happening. We're focused on one industry, but this one industry we believe is going to have a massive ripple effect around the world, because if we can prove that this is bad for pilots and it was illegal for pilots, then what about the flight attendants? What about the ground crew? What about you as the passenger? It's bad for all of us, right? We all work, sit and work and fly in the same environments. So that's really why this is so big, because we transcend national borders now. And when we're bringing this international pressure and affecting, international governments, including our own, we stand to bring fundamental changes. And it doesn't actually take that many people to do it. It takes a group of people who are very passionate about it and who are willing to devote a lot of time and effort into it. And the attorneys, I can tell you, that have stepped forward, it's incredible. They are working really hard for not a lot of money, a lot of them, to make sure that we can actually pull this off, because they understand the importance of what it is that we're doing. And, the doctors and all these people, they're volunteering their time between helping the vaccine injured and then also, working as witnesses and helping, compile data and that type of thing. So I guess what I'm asking you today is I'm asking you to support us in any way that we can. We're all 100% volunteer. Nobody takes a paycheck from U.S. Freedom Flyers at all. And that's something I said from the very beginning. This is not about enriching ourselves and building an organization that's paying a bunch of people and becomes top-heavy. It's about people who are willing to make personal sacrifices and step forward and actually do something for their country and their fellow employees and to bring an end to this madness. And we're going to be getting passengers involved more. We have a lot of passengers that are currently involved, but we're working on a new idea. We believe that it's going to bring integrity back in for passengers as well. So stay tuned for that. That'll be something coming soon, and I don't think the airlines are going to be super excited about it, because it turns out when you mistreat a very large number of people, what is it? Probably between 2 and 3 million a day, something like that. I think the numbers are. That's a lot of pressure, if you can get people involved. So if we can get even 5% of those people involved, that stands to bring a really fundamental change to everything that's happening. And in addition to this, you probably saw the trucker convoy that came across the nation. That was, once again, normal people that came together. And one of the primary organizers for that was a lady by the name of Maureen Steele. She's a mom of 7 from Montana. And she saw a problem, and she stepped up and she did something about it. So once again, just a very average, normal person that made a huge fundamental change, and did something that garnered international media attention and drew attention to an issue. So I guess that's what I'm asking you for today is for your participation. I care a lot more about your participation and spreading the word and standing up and saying no than I do about the money that you can donate to U.S. Freedom Flyers. But if you do want to donate to the cause, it's usfreedomflyers.org, and you can donate there. So I guess now, if anybody has any questions, that's probably the most important. I'm sure I missed things. I'm sure people have questions, and I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. I fully support you. I just want to ask you about a nuance here. I think you would agree with me that the burden is not on you to show that the vaccines do harm. The burden, when you have a government that specifically protects the drug companies from lawsuits, that the burden is on them to prove that it's safe. But, and therefore I think that, because your right not to take the vaccine is simply your right, full stop. But then you have made statements, and which I would want to question about the harm that it's done. And as you, I'm sure, are fully aware, if you're a strict, a green eye shade scientist, you could say, well, look, stuff happens. You can't use random anecdotes. You need a control group of people who didn't take it with those who did. But you are apparently asserting that the harm is and the risks are palpable. I took the vax. I'm 77. Most of us, didn't seem to harm us. But if you want to, so I urge you to say that we're not putting this on the top of the marquee that it does harm. We're just saying that there's no assurance that that it's safe, and every individual has a right not to take it. Full stop. But if you want to speak to how does it do harm and why do you believe that, I'd be curious to know your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question. So one of the biggest problems that we have is the immunity from the vaccine manufacturers, which has been in place for a long time. And it is the government's job, you're absolutely correct, to protect the consumer. So as far as the studies that you're talking about and the reason that some people have been harmed and others haven't, there's very interesting data that's coming out of several European studies that is now showing that a lot of the early rollout of the vaccines were actually placebos. And the belief is that it was to build consumer confidence. And they did so very effectively with that. And I agree that this is a liberty issue. It's the fact of having the choice. And so thank God you're not having issues. And there are a lot of people who are not having issues. And when it comes to what the actual numbers look like of the people that are experiencing adverse reactions, I can't give you that number because large enough studies haven't been done, but there have been controlled studies done with fairly large groups, and we're working on some of that data coming out. And I guess just to validate some of what I've been saying, obviously I know I know a lot of people at U.S. Freedom Flyers that have come forward with injuries. And actually yesterday flying here, there was an American Airlines retiree sitting behind me who ended up in the hospital. She was talking to her seatmate. And I connected with her a little bit later, and she said, yeah, in fact, I had some major issues. So that's just one story. What is interesting, and I forgot to mention, is I'm working with a data analyst who works for large insurance groups. And she had seen some of the interviews that I had done, and she contacted me, and she said, look, the data's a lot worse than what you're seeing. There was like a 160% increase in I believe, in deaths last year they had to pay out on life insurance. In 2021 over like a 10-month period. And I just spoke to her again the other day, and she said, look, what they're doing now is they're pulling out aviation and pilot data because they insure both large aviation companies and pilots specifically in healthcare and then also in life insurance. And she said the numbers that I've been putting out are considerably higher than what I even know. And so that's going to be really interesting when that data comes out, when that study's completed, and we'll certainly be publishing that. Because I think it's very valid, but I can tell you that a lot of the Global COVID Summit doctors, they are now doing large studies, and especially in Europe to actually definitively prove this. While a lot of it is anecdotal evidence, it's hard to say that when somebody gets vaccinated and then 3 days later when they had they're a healthy pilot who goes through a flight physical either every 1 year or 6 months depending on your age, and you have no issues, and suddenly you change one thing in your life. And then you have a heart attack, or you have a cerebral bleed, or something major, a major event happens, and there's thousands of them happening. The question has to be asked: what's going on?
Thank you for what you're doing. My question, first, it sounds like the success you've had has something to do with the fact that you're a smaller group of highly skilled people in an industry that really needs you, and the pilots have been treated like shit through this thing for whatever it's been, 2 years. Passengers have been treated like shit for over 20 years at least. I wondered if there's any kind of associated movements with you guys. You got the TSA, the FFA restricting which airlines can compete. Is there any broader freedom movement in the pilots?
Yes, there is. That's actually what we're working on right now. Is we're looking on expanding that footprint. Obviously, I'm focused on pilots because that's the easiest group right now. And it's because we are so regulated that it actually gives us some teeth when it comes to negotiating these types of things. But I completely agree with you. There needs to be something for the passengers because they have just been completely mistreated for a long time. And there's actually, like what I talked about like the, canceling flights and coding them weather when in fact it was crew, that type of thing. That's consumer fraud. And I'm not aware of any third-party organization that's currently dealing with this. They tell you to go contact, the DOT or there's different portals where you can go and you can make a complaint, but as we know, nothing happens because they are the government, right? And they're doing the regulation. So we're working on a third-party consumer protection organization that will do exactly that. That will hold their feet to the fire, and hold them accountable and make them actually do the right thing. which is unfortunate. You know, we shouldn't even need unions. I quite frankly can't stand the unions. That was a point I didn't touch on earlier. The unions were just as totalitarian as the companies. They were actually worse in a lot of cases. The very people that we pay to represent us absolutely did not represent us, and they sided with the companies and the government, and so they are also liable.
So first of all, thank you for coming, and thank you for all that you've done for people in America and elsewhere. So if a passenger is flying, like let's say myself, I'm going to be visiting family in August, what's some direct action that somebody can do while they're actually a passenger? Because it's not like people are passengers frequently, and so I think that if we're going to be flying, we'd like to make the most out of that.
At this time, it's probably supporting our organization because we're bringing litigation to hold them accountable. But I think, you know, once we get this the passenger advocacy up and running, you know, that's going to be really the place to be. Because then when you're having problems and you can submit that, and then we have the data. Once we can collect the data on that, and we can prove it, because what's really unfortunate for the companies and really good for us is that U.S. freedom flyers aren't just pilots. They work in the dispatch department. They work in the scheduling department and on the ground crews, and so we get lots of feedback. And it's pretty easy for me to find out if a flight that was coded for weather was actually for crew shortages. So once we can start, you know, comparing a specific flight, you're on, you know, American 1060.
I'm wondering if any injured pilots or pilots that have died due to vaccine injury, if the workers' compensation insurance companies or the larger system, is this involved? Is anyone getting money, or are you having to be dealing with the insurance companies on this issue, and how is that interplaying with everything?
Sure. So the way that's working is when they go out on disability, they have a heart attack or something, they'll get paid long-term disability from the company. They'll never admit that it was from a vaccine injury. However, the 3 pilots that I just mentioned, when they then go to get new insurance, they're now being told they're uninsurable because they took an experimental medical product. So it's this like vicious cycle, and I know that for a fact. I mean, Cody Flint has gone through this process, and he's extensively documented it. And yeah, so he's gotten no help from the government, even though it's been proven that he had a vaccine injury, 100%, you know, without doubt. You know, there's an organization within the government, I forget now what it is or what it's called, but that's their job, is to pay out for vaccine injuries, right? Because the companies don't have liability. So this government agency was founded, but to date they've only paid out just a handful of claims, and not for the COVID-19 vaccines. I mean, Cody is like the perfect case. He can absolutely prove it. And it said, sorry, you've been denied. This didn't happen to you, even though world-renowned experts are saying that's absolutely what happened to you. And then when he goes, you know, he doesn't have a long-term disability program. He didn't work for a large company. And so now he's trying to get, you know, like health insurance for his family, and he's being told, sorry, you're uninsurable. You voluntarily took an experimental product.
But if a pilot was on a flight and some piece of equipment hit him on the head, he would get covered from workers' compensation.
That's correct.
But you're not able to make the argument because they were forced to take this vaccine as part of their job that falls under the workers' compensation.
Yeah, that doesn't fall under workers' comp. That would fall under the long-term disability insurance programs, which we have at the airlines, many of which are garbage, to be honest. I mean, you make a fraction of what you would have made as a pilot if you'd maintained your health. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's a really easy cop-out for them. They don't really feel the pain.
Thank you.
Just like everybody else, thank you very much for speaking out. I'm curious, were there or are there any airlines or other organizations that have been actually better than others in terms of supporting your cause, or not as tyrannical or as oppressive, that maybe the general population can support, vote with their dollars, that sort of thing?
Well, that's a really good question. The question was, is there a place that you can go? Is there an airline that actually did the right thing? I'm still looking for them, you know? I I think it was Spirit Airlines. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Spirit backed off the mandate pretty early on. Took exemptions, that type of thing. But American, United, Delta, all the big ones, JetBlue, Frontier. I mean, they were horrible to their employees, and it's the other thing I failed to touch on is the rash of suicides that came out of this. I know of quite a few of them, and have actually been to the bedsides of a couple of people, who attempted suicide over this vaccine mandate. And I can tell you that it's one of the saddest things, because had they held on, we did ultimately, we did get a lot of wins, and many of them would have been able to keep their jobs in the end. But I can tell you in the days of October and November, those were very bleak days, and it was brutal.
You could fly NetJets. They didn't mistreat their pilots.
Yes, NetJets. I need to give a shout out to them. I forgot. Unfortunately, they're not exactly cheap to fly on, but if you have the money to do it, I strongly suggest that you support NetJets. They have actually taken they didn't take a super strong stance, but they did. They said, we're not going to mandate it here. And I know a couple of pilot friends of mine who lost their jobs at other places who have moved over to NetJets, and they're actually very happy with the way they're being treated. But I think, they were smart enough to realize that this isn't a fight that they wanted to get involved in, because if you do, they're operating on very low margins, just like everyone else, with their crews. And all it takes, unlike an airline where you have hubs and you can pull in reserve pilots and that type of thing. If a NetJets plane is sitting out at some outstation, and that pilot goes out, I mean, it disrupts the entire operation. You're flying around very high net wealth people who are not going to be happy with the cancellation of their flights.
A couple other observations. I was supposed to fly on a United flight. They canceled it 23 hours in advance and claimed ATC delays. How they were so psychic to know that there were going to be ATC delays that were going to cause this flight to be canceled in 23 hours from now, I haven't figured that part out yet.
It depends. I don't want to take too strong of a stance on that. If they knew there was a big weather system moving in or something like that, But yeah, that's they like to use every excuse in the book. I can tell you that. Unless I knew of the specific flight details, I don't want to strongly come out on it and say that that they were taking advantage of you. They may or may not have. I mean, there's obviously a probability that they did. But yeah, United. Scott Kirby over at United, the CEO, he is hands down the worst airline CEO on the planet. He was the one that came out and said, listen, we're mandating this, regardless of the federal government. And he actually went around and tried to form a coalition of other airline CEOs saying, look, we need to all band together and all force our employees to get vaccinated, essentially so there's no other place for them to go and they have no choice and they just have to do it.
No place except NetJets.
Right, no place except for NetJets.
I had not heard about them using a placebo in the early part of the trials, but that sounds like almost an admission of guilt. They knew the vaccine was going to harm people, so they want to say, oh, see how many people we gave it to, it didn't harm. Let's lower the average by giving placebo.
There's a website you can go to, I believe it's howbadismybatch.com. And if you have a vaccine card, there's a lot number on there. And you can actually trace your lot number and you can see how toxic that specific batch was. The one thing that has been definitively proven is that they were not all manufactured with the same levels of like potency or toxicity. And that's why a lot of these doctors that are in this fight, they're now recommending, like if you've gotten the first 2 shots or one J&J, whatever you do, don't get a booster. Because let's say you got one of the ones with like lower levels of toxicity early in the beginning, and then you go in and you get a booster that has double the levels. That's one thing I can tell you that we've seen among pilots is it's when they get the booster, that's when like major cardiac and neurological conditions come out. The DMED data, neurological conditions over a 10-month period increased by 1,135%. And that's completely out of control. So something obviously happened there. I was contacted by a state trooper down in South Carolina who was telling me that traffic accidents have increased over 2021, had increased by 300%. And they were finding that many people were like dead on arrival, and it wasn't from the accident. And what we're working on now is trying to get that same data from single-engine aircraft accidents from the FAA. They obviously don't want to come off this data. They claim they don't even keep it. But there again, having those internal people at the FAA, they're scouring records and trying to come up with conclusive data on this. We know that something's going on, but I don't want to say it definitively before I actually have the numbers in front of me. But that's something that we're looking into. If you have a single pilot and you don't have that pilot redundancy of having 2 pilots like at the airlines, and something happens to them, they have a heart attack, well, it's game over.
What specific things can we do to help the cause?
Right now, it would be helping support U.S. freedom flyers, if you could. And because I think that bringing this litigation, one of the big reasons we're bringing it is to make sure that the truth comes out during the discovery phase of the litigation. Because when we can do that, we can force the documents onto the table and out in a public court, and we can televise those court hearings, then the American people can see what's actually been going on.
Hello, thanks for your activism. Have you had any political support from any of the major parties, and have you considered reaching out to the Libertarian Party and doing some sort of coalition with the Libertarian Party, because they seem to be wanting to go into that direction? So.
We have not reached out to the Libertarian Party, at least not on a large scale, and that's actually, if y'all could help with that, that would be amazing. To get some people involved. But I can tell you, the Republicans and the Democrats, there have been a few, like, Ted Cruz has come out and he said, like, oh, this is terrible what United's doing. But I mean, he's just such a rhino. He's not actually doing anything about it. He just talks. The person that has been in this fight, absolutely, that I kind of forgot, is Senator Johnson. Senator Johnson held the hearing for Teresa Long and Pete Chambers, and he's done, COVID roundtables and all this stuff. But ultimately, nothing has really happened. One guy can't really do that much about it except for bring awareness. But he has very much been on our side, and we're really thankful for him.
Another quick question. So, is it a part, perhaps, of the long-term vision of the Freedom Flyers to maybe help pilots network to potentially make their own airline that maybe would be able to better resist against the fascist sort of mingling between the airlines and the government? Because I think that that's the only way that we would be able to move forward, is by creating an institution separate that would be impervious to that sort of attack again.
Yeah, I really like the idea, and I'm a huge supporter of the parallel economy concept. I think that's really important. Unfortunately, starting an airline requires a tremendous amount of capital and also political connection, and you need slots at airports. You need to actually be able to get a gate, and that's controlled by the government. And so trying to bring in this freedom-based airline, I mean, while it's a phenomenal concept and actually something I would love to see and I'd love to get behind, I think it's finding somebody that has the political connections, the clout, the money, who is starting the airline, who's sympathetic to the cause, and then hiring the people that are want to come and join them. And there is actually a charter company right now. It's just contacted yesterday, I think it was, and the CEO wants to have a conversation. He wants to hire unvaccinated pilots. But we have to run into the problem of discrimination, just like we saw with firing the unvaccinated. There has to be a balance there. I'm not sure exactly how that's addressed. But I can tell you there are a lot of very wealthy people I've been reached out to by billionaires who said, hey, can you help me find 4 or 5 pilots? Because I do not want vaccinated pilots flying my airplanes. I see what's going on here. And I think that's almost more telling than even some of the data coming out is that when these very wealthy people are absolutely adamant that they don't want vaccinated pilots, that tells you all you need to know. Anyone else? Thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. And it's been a pleasure being here. Thanks for hosting me.